All right. So this is some research that I've been working on in the last few weeks, and things are kind of coming together in reference to this topic. This is so basically I was doing little research and whatnot, and I came across some information that said the Gospels are second century texts, right? Now, I had not heard that theory before, and I basically held the scholars, the scholarly consensus, which is that Mark was written first in around 70 AD, after 70 AD or so, then Matthew and Luke, and then John used his own, Matthew and Luke between 80 and 90, give or take, and then John late 90s, early 100s, right? And I was going with that. But then I came across a theory that said that none of the early church fathers, and when I say early, what I'm speaking on is the church fathers that came out from Clement up until 150, 170 AD, mentions any of the Gospels by name. They don't talk about them. They don't talk about the stories in them, so on and so forth, right? And so that made me wonder, like, when were these texts actually written? So I'm doing research. I read Clement of Rome. I've read Ignatius, one other father, I forget his name at the moment. No, not one other, several others. Hegesippus, so on and so forth. And I'm seeing that there are no New Testament stories. Now, there's a Clement of Rome, the second letter of Clement of Rome, but it's called a homily, meaning that they don't think Clement wrote it because it's not in Clement's style, and it doesn't follow whatever grammatical textual structure that Clement follows, right? And so, I'm looking, because even when you read the second letter of Clement, you to whoever he was writing to at the moment, I can't recall. You see that Clement begins to quote heavily from the Gospels. So, and that book right there shows that there were Gospels at that time, but upon further analysis, people are the consensus is, this is why it's called a homily. The consensus is that text was written around somewhere between 170 AD and not during the actual time of the actual Clement of Rome, right? And so then this is interesting, because when you read Paul and Peter, right? When you read the epistles, they're actually sounding very similar. There are no synoptic stories of Jesus in the epistles. So the epistles, Paul's epistles, the Peter, John, the epistles themselves are all in the same line, in the same vein, has the early church fathers. And it's very similar, especially when you read Ignatius. Ignatius is fighting against other groups of Christians, and I want to say Docetus, right? Because Paul alludes to that in his Gospels when they say, do not, he speaks against following those who say that Christ didn't come in the flesh. Well, if you read that, it's a particular type of Christianity called Docetism, right? Now, there are some people in the community that are dismissing Gnosticism because they say it's a second century outgrowth. But Docetism is concurrent with Paul. It is a valid Christianity with Paul, and the early church fathers are fighting this brand of Judaic Christianity. This is a natural outgrowth of Judaic spiritual thought. But the church fathers, Rome, is trying to take control of Judaic thought. This is aligned and attuned to Joseph Atwell's theory that Rome used Josephus to create the Synoptic Gospels. It is also attuned to Richard Carrier's analysis, looking at the Gospel of Mark, using Old Testament stories to create the Jesus of the Bible. Interesting. A lot of things line up. And Paul, even Paul may have been writing later. If we give Paul a later date, we can even give him more than the 7 confirmed letters of Paul that are currently in the Bible. So this is what I'm working on now. Because it's when you read Clement, Clement clearly was a genius. Clement of Rome, or whatever. And he quotes heavily from the Old Testament. When he talks about the beauty of women and the high esteem and standard by which they're held to in the Old Testament, he could have easily fit in the virgin birth and talking about the chastity and the noble character of Mary, but he doesn't. He doesn't mention any synoptic gospel stories. And then I didn't even know this. I have to look when I get home. I'll look at my notes to further validate that the New Testament stories were taken from Old Testament literature. There is something in Proverbs. There's a saying in Proverbs that says, "On this day I have begotten thee." The same phraseology which was said when the dove descended from the sky and landed on Jesus, and there was a voice heard from the sky, "On this day I have begotten thee." It makes sense that the writers of the New Testament used Old Testament motifs to appeal to the consciousness of the Jewish people at the time. Something's going on here. Definitely something's going on here. But anyway, food for thought. That's what I've been working on. Those of you that are following me on my other project that you can't find anymore, I am currently trying to locate that book. I may have to travel a bit. I went to the Library of Congress, couldn't find it there. So now I may have to go to Stanford, not Stanford, but one of these, whatever is on the East Coast here, and go into the library to find the book. So that's what I'm doing currently. Might have to take a trip and travel to see if I can get it. But light and love, peace and blessings. Hope all is well and blessed.